Detective Eric Lawson had always been a man people trusted without question. In Ridgewood, a peaceful town where crime was rare and neighbors knew each other by name, Eric was seen as the symbol of safety. He wasn't just an officer. He was part of the community's identity. Children waved at him when he drove by in his patrol car, and elderly residents often mentioned how lucky the town was to have such a dedicated man protecting them. His house stood on Willow Lane, looking as ordinary as any other in the neighborhood. White picket fence, neatly trimmed hedges, and a freshly painted mailbox. To anyone passing by, it looked like the home of someone who lived a simple, honest life. But appearances are often deceiving. Eric followed a strict routine. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, he would step out in his perfectly ironed uniform, coffee in hand, and drive to the station. After his shift ended, he'd return home promptly, greeting neighbors if they were outside, yet never engaging in long conversations. People found his quiet nature comforting, assuming it was a sign of discipline and focus. What they didn't realize was that Eric's silence wasn't because of professionalism. It was because he was hiding something. At night, when most of Ridgewood was asleep, Eric's garage came to life. Dim lights flickered from inside, casting long shadows across the driveway. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of him working on something, tools clinking softly in the dark. He'd told a few curious residents that he enjoyed restoring old furniture in his spare time. That simple explanation was enough for everyone. After all, he was Eric Lawson. Why would anyone doubt him? But in recent months, a strange smell began to linger on the neighborhood, especially near his house. Some described it as metallic. Others compared it to rotting food. Complaints trickled in, but when officers checked the area, Eric himself was usually the one handling those reports. Calmly, he reassured residents that the smell was from a dead raccoon he'd found near his backyard. He even showed concerned neighbors the remains of the animal, carefully staged as proof. Everyone believed him. No one thought to look any closer. What the town didn't know was that beneath Eric's tidy garage lay something far more disturbing than an old workbench or broken chairs. Behind stacks of neatly placed boxes, there was a locked door, small, rusted, and almost invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. A door that Eric ensured was always hidden. This door wasn't just part of his house. It was part of his secret. For years, Eric had been preparing, planning, and building something behind that door. And every night he spent working in his garage wasn't about restoring anything. It was about controlling what he kept hidden from the world. Still, no one asked questions. After all, he was the town's trusted officer, the man who answered their calls. The man who promised to keep them safe. And as the strange smell faded with time and people returned to their quiet lives, Eric continued working in silence, knowing that no one in Ridgewood could ever imagine the nightmare he was carefully hiding just behind that door. For months, Ridgewood had been living under the shadow of something no one could explain. Women were vanishing one after another, leaving behind only confusion and fear. These weren't people who led risky lives or had enemies lurking in the background. They were everyday women, students, waitresses, nurses. They had families, friends, and routines like everyone else. Yet they disappeared without a trace, leaving behind cold dinners on kitchen tables and unanswered messages on their phones. What troubled the town even more was that there were no clues. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no evidence of struggle. It was as if these women had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Eric Lawson was at the center of the investigation. He was the one people looked to for answers, leading search parties and reviewing evidence with a calm determination that seemed unbreakable. He stood at press conferences, assuring families and reporters that every lead was being followed, every resource being used. His voice was steady, his words carefully chosen. To those watching, he appeared to be doing everything he could, but every missing person case Eric handled was a dead end. His reports showed patterns of hopelessness, evidence that didn't exist, and leads that always dissolved into nothing. Families began losing hope, and soon the town accepted that these women were simply gone. Some believed they had run away. Others feared something worse, but had no proof to confirm it. Over time, their faces on missing posters faded, and life in Ridgewood attempted to move forward. What no one realized was that the predator they feared was standing right in front of them. Eric knew every step of the investigation because he controlled it. He misled his team without raising suspicion, pointing them in directions he knew would lead nowhere. Every piece of evidence that could have exposed him was carefully removed or never documented in the first place. Eric wasn't chasing the criminal. He was the criminal. And he had been for longer than anyone could imagine. His victims weren't random. Each woman who vanished shared something chillingly specific. They looked alike: dark hair, pale skin, slender figures. To his colleagues, this small detail wasn't significant enough to connect the cases, but to Eric, it was deliberate. Each woman was chosen because she resembled someone from his past. His ex-fiancée, the woman who had left him years ago without warning, leaving behind a heart full of bitterness and a mind full of darkness. Her betrayal had shattered something deep inside him. Over time, that wound festered, twisting into hatred that demanded release. Eric didn't want justice. He wanted control. Control over what he lost. Control over the pain that haunted him. And so he hunted women who looked like her, each one becoming a substitute for the life he believed was stolen from him. The secret room behind his garage door wasn't a simple workspace. It was where he brought them. Each woman who vanished from Ridgewood ended up trapped behind that door, stripped of freedom, of hope, of life itself. He kept them there for days, sometimes weeks, until his anger was satisfied. Then, like the others, they disappeared forever, their remains hidden in places no one would think to search, all while the town slept peacefully, trusting the man who was supposed to protect them. Eric Lawson wore the badge of a hero, but inside, he was something far worse than any criminal Ridgewood had ever known. One night, during a heavy rainstorm that swept through Ridgewood, an officer named Darren Mitchell found himself driving through Eric Lawson's neighborhood. He wasn't there on a special assignment. It was just a routine patrol during the storm. But as he passed Eric's house, something unusual caught his eye. Through the fogged window of Eric's garage, Darren noticed faint flickering lights. At first, he assumed it was just a reflection of passing cars, but as he slowed down, he saw movement. A shadow, brief but unmistakable, crossed behind the window. Darren hesitated. It wasn't like Eric to work so late at night, especially during the storm. His instincts, trained over years on the force, told him something felt wrong. Still, he told himself it was probably nothing. Maybe Eric was fixing something damaged by the rain. But curiosity won over hesitation, and Darren decided to check in, more out of concern than suspicion. Pulling into the driveway, Darren walked up to the garage. He knocked gently, calling out, but the sound of rain muffled his voice. Moments later, Eric appeared, looking calm, though perhaps slightly surprised. He explained that he was working on some shelves that had collapsed in the storm. His tone was casual, steady, as always. He invited Darren in for a quick look, perhaps sensing the need to maintain his carefully constructed image. Inside, the garage appeared normal at first glance. Tools were scattered around, a broken shelf leaned against the wall, and a workbench stood cluttered with wood and nails. Everything seemed to match Eric's explanation. Yet Darren couldn't shake the unease tightening in his stomach. His eyes wandered across the space until they landed on something at the far end of the garage, a door, small, rusted, and barely visible behind stacked plastic boxes. It looked out of place in the otherwise neat garage. Darren felt drawn to it, like it was silently demanding attention. He asked Eric about it, masking his curiosity behind casual conversation. Eric laughed softly, his tone effortlessly controlled. He told Darren it was just a storage room, filled with old junk and supplies. He rarely used. Darren nodded, pretending to accept the answer. But something felt wrong. The moment lingered. Eric watched him carefully, measuring his reactions. Darren, sensing the tension, decided not to push further that night. He forced a smile, thanked Eric for letting him in, and left. Yet the image of that door burned in his mind long after he drove away. For days, Darren couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. The flickering lights, the shadows, the locked door, hidden behind box, as none of it sat right. He debated returning, wondered if he was imagining things, questioned whether suspicion alone justified action against a fellow officer. After all, Eric was Ridgewood's trusted detective. To accuse him of anything would not only risk Darren's career, but could damage the reputation of the entire department. But doubt grew stronger each passing day. Darren began quietly reviewing reports tied to the missing women. He looked for overlooked connections, signs of manipulation in the investigations, anything that might justify his growing concern. What he found unsettled him even more. Eric had been involved in nearly every step of each missing persons case. He'd written most of the reports. He'd led most of the searches. Patterns Darren hadn't noticed before began to surface. Still, he had no real evidence, just a feeling, a locked door. And a nightmare, slowly taking shape in the back of his mind. The storm that had hovered over Ridgewood for days finally reached its peak one night. Heavy rain flooded streets, wind uprooted trees, and basements across the town began to fill with water. On Willow Lane, the force of the storm was even more damaging. The water crept into Eric Lawson's garage, seeping into cracks and pushing against the walls with relentless pressure. As the night wore on, the weakened back wall of the garage finally gave way. Part of it crumbled, revealing something no one was supposed to see. Early the next morning, a neighbor walking past Eric's house noticed the damage. Part of the garage wall had collapsed, and behind the debris, there was a door that no one in the neighborhood had ever seen before. It looked old and rusted, as though it had been there for years, hidden from view. Curious and concerned that the property might be unsafe, the neighbor called emergency services, reporting the structural collapse and potential flooding. Officers arrived quickly, not yet suspecting that they were about to uncover a nightmare. Since Eric was on duty elsewhere that morning, the officers forced entry into the garage to assess the situation. They didn't expect to find much, maybe some damaged tools or floodwater pooling in the corners. But when they moved past the debris and approached the hidden door, unease began to build. The door was locked, but weakened by years of moisture and the recent collapse. With some force, it broke open. What lay behind it would haunt everyone who saw it. The small hidden room was not a storage space. It was a chamber of horrors. The walls were lined with crude metal cages, barely large enough for a person to sit in. Chains hung from hooks bolted into the concrete. The smell inside was overpowering, a suffocating mix of decay and chemicals. Pools of dried, dark stains marked the floor. In the corners, piles of human bones were scattered, some stripped clean, others broken and shattered. The air itself felt heavy, as if every scream and plea ever uttered in that room still clung to the walls. Along one side of the room, investigators found photographs pinned up in careful rows. Each image was of a different woman. Faces once familiar to the community now stared blankly from behind plastic sleeves. Each photo was marked with dates and handwritten notes. Victim profiles, records, trophies. Some of the women in the photos were officially listed as missing. Others, investigators realized with growing horror, had never even been reported as lost. Eric Lawson had kept them hidden here, while he worked cases by day. shook hands with neighbors, and stood at press conferences. Offering hope to grieving families, he was returning each night to this room. The room where he tortured, experimented, and eventually killed the women he'd carefully chosen. Officers stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Some had worked side by side with Eric for years. They had shared coffee breaks, discussed cases, and trusted him with their lives. To realize that this chamber of death had existed under their noses, hidden behind the uniform of a man they admired, was almost too much to comprehend. Word spread fast. Commanders were alerted, and a citywide manhunt for Eric Lawson was launched. Immediately, he was still on duty somewhere in Ridgewood when officers found his hidden room. When they finally arrested him that afternoon, Eric did not resist. He showed no emotion, no fear, no anger. His calmness was perhaps the most chilling thing of all. As they led him away, officers struggled with the same unanswerable question. How could the man they trusted hide something so monstrous just behind the door? After Eric Lawson was arrested, the entire town of Ridgewood seemed to fall silent. People who once felt safe now questioned every familiar face they passed on the street. The officer they had trusted to protect them had been the predator among them all along. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a betrayal in human form. Inside the police station, Eric sat quietly in the interrogation room, staring blankly at the wall as detectives tried to understand how a man who once stood for justice had become something so cold and calculated. He refused to speak. Hours passed in silence. No confessions. No explanations. Just the same blank stare that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. Investigators were left to piece together the story from the evidence they recovered in his hidden room. Each photo on the wall had been matched to missing persons files. Eric's notes revealed that every victim had been meticulously chosen. They all shared the same features: dark hair, slender build, soft facial structure. A pattern overlooked for years. What linked them even further was a single unassuming photograph found tucked into Eric's wallet after his arrest. It was of a woman none of the officers recognized. After extensive research, they discovered her identity: Emily Carter, Eric's ex-fiancée from nearly 15 years ago. She had left him abruptly, relocating to another state. Her departure had been the catalyst. Eric's obsession hadn't started with strangers. It had started with her. The breakup had shattered his mind. But instead of seeking help, Eric buried his pain under layers of control and precision. Over time, his need for revenge twisted into a ritual. His victims weren't chosen at random. They were replacements for the woman who had abandoned him. He didn't kill Emily Carter, but he killed her over and over again in the faces of every woman he captured. Investigators concluded that the hidden room had been built not long after she left him. Each tool, each lock, each chain, everything inside that hidden space had been prepared long before the first woman went missing. But what disturbed the officers most wasn't just the discovery of the murders. It was how easily Eric had led a double life. For years, he stood beside his colleagues, leading investigations that he sabotaged from the inside. Every time a body was hidden, Eric was the first to volunteer for the search team, knowing exactly where not to look. He controlled the reports, the evidence, and the direction of every case. He convinced grieving families to keep hoping, even as he knew there was no hope left. The community's pain deepened when news outlets nationwide began reporting the case. Ridgewood, once a quiet, forgotten town, became a symbol of trust shattered beyond repair. People questioned how someone like Eric could slip through unnoticed for so long. The answer was simple yet terrifying. He wore the perfect disguise. His badge, Eric Lawson, was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never spoke a word during his trial, refusing to explain or defend himself. To this day, no one knows if it was guilt, pride, or pure emptiness. That kept him silent. What remained clear, however, was that the man who once promised to protect Ridgewood had spent years constructing a nightmare behind the locked door of his garage. And behind that door, hidden in plain sight, he killed, not in rage but in silence.